I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 75 of EO Radio Show. This is our 10th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on the state filings in Nevada, Arizona, Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and most recently, Florida and Louisiana. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we move south to look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in North Carolina and South Carolina. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there is a playlist just for state filing requirement episodes. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. And this is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information that varies state to state. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we're focusing on ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in North Carolina or South Carolina or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. For the details on these states, we welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella, and he specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back, Joe.
Hey, it's good to be back.
So let's start with North Carolina today. How does a nonprofit form in North Carolina? What documents do we start with?
For sure. So the Secretary of State is what governs North Carolina entity formations. And for nonprofit corporations, they have the Form N01, just an Articles of Incorporation. It's a 2-page form, and it covers the basics. We always talk about the address, the agent, the formation date you want. Interesting items of note. In Section 2, there's a checkbox for whether the nonprofit will be defined as a charitable or religious corporation under the North Carolina General Statutes, Section 55A 140. This is something we don't usually see. Usually you kind of put that in which one you're going to be, but here it's an actual checkbox. And then the next section, Section 6, is a checkbox for whether there will be members. We've talked about this before where that's an unlikely item that you will have, but nevertheless, they want to give you the option here so that's in your mind. Section 7 notes, quote, attached are provisions regarding the distribution of the corporation's assets upon its dissolution, unquote. And then they provide reference to a Form N14 as their exemplar. N14 is interesting in that you can actually use it. It's not simply an exemplar. It has a checkbox list of the generic purpose items you can mark: religious, charitable, educational, etc. All the normal notes. It also has the 501c3 language we often discuss in terms of what you need for dissolution. It also notes prohibited activities under the IRS codes and sets up the standard dissolution language. It's a good insert and makes the filing much more robust than many we've looked at where we've had just forms before. And then going back into what the N01 says, Section 8 is another attachment section for other items. The instructions note this is for, quote, other provisions that may address the purpose of the corporation, the limitation of liability, etc. Again, per the statutes in Chapter 55 of the North Carolina General Statutes. So they really want you to think about what you're putting in, and again, very specifically to North Carolina, what you may want to put in terms of what their local rules and local laws say. Section 10 allows for listing of the officers and notes that it is optional. Now, this is something that's really different from what we've seen in other states. We've seen where it's mandatory to name the directors and the officers, and here it's only optional. This field is being provided in order to assist business entities in identifying its company officials and complying with federal banking regulations, unquote. But again, it's not mandatory.
So on that note, before we go on to what foreign nonprofits do, I just want to mention for our listeners that for listeners that are wondering that what the distinction is between a member, a director, and an officer, we have an early episode on EO Radio Show that walks through the difference in those terms. They're kind of terms of art in the nonprofit field, and they don't always mean what nonprofit leaders and organizers think they mean. If you're interested in understanding when you would have actual members of a nonprofit or what that means, what your directors are, what their duties are, go back and look at one of those early or listen to that early episode. We'll put a link in the show notes. So I just thought I'd mention that here because it doesn't come very often that the term member is brought into the Articles of Incorporation, but North Carolina does. And so there's my little helpful tidbit. Leaving that little field trip, as they call a conversation loop like that, back to our agenda. What does a foreign nonprofit do when they enter the state of North Carolina with their business activities or solicitation, which is the most common for a nonprofit?
For the nonprofits, the state has a Form N09, which is an application for Certificate of Authority for Nonprofit Corporations. It's also a 2-page form and very similar to what we just discussed with the domestic articles. It has the same basics, name, address here, where you've been incorporated, where your state of formation is. Unlike the domestic, Section 9 does ask for the names and business addresses of all of your officers. And Section 10 is a checkbox, again, on the members, as we just discussed, with similar to what we saw with the domestic articles. Both these filings can be done online. That is the preferred method from North Carolina. On their website, they have a specific PDF upload portal for submitting these documents. So you just fill them out. They're filling PDFs. You sign them, load them back up, and shoot them right through the system. It's not when we've talked about some of them, like with California, where you can it's an actual pass-through and you type it into the form as you go. This one, you actually can download the form and then upload it back up, which quite frankly is easy because it makes it a lot easier to look at what you've put in and look at it before you've actually filed it.
That's nice. So what does the cost look like in the response time for filing?
So the filing fee is $60 for the domestic and $125 for the foreign. Per the North Carolina website last week on March 12th, normal processing time is 5 to 7 business days. They do offer a 24-hour expedite of $100 and a same day if it's before noon Eastern Standard Time of $200.
Interesting. So any other state agencies in North Carolina for a nonprofit to register with?
Again, in North Carolina, if they're registered or organized in North Carolina, or they solicit, hold assets, or do business there in North Carolina, you will be required to register with the Secretary of State's Charities Division and file an annual report. This is interesting to note, is generally it's not handled by the Secretary of State. We've seen this usually with attorney generals, but the Secretary of State here does both the charity registrations and the actual registration of your entity itself. And then additionally, for obtaining any tax exemptions in North Carolina, the nonprofit will need to apply with the Department of Revenue there in North Carolina. A link to all of these can be found in the show notes as well, to the various parts of the Secretary of State and to the Department of Revenue.
So if the nonprofit is registered with the Secretary of State's Charities Division and files an annual report, 2 questions there. Is that annual report uploaded on a portal somewhere so that it's public? And secondly, does that report include names of directors and officers?
Yes, the report does have all of the officer information, the director information. It's similar to what we see here in California with an RRF-1, where you've got the taxes uploaded with it as well. I believe that it is publicly available, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I don't know for sure, though.
We'll put a note in the show notes on that point for anybody who's interested about what actually ends up being very transparent in North Carolina. You can find it there. State tax exemption in North Carolina. Is that a separate process?
Yes, that goes through their Department of Revenue, and they have a couple of separate different forms for sales tax exemptions and also just for your general withholdings.
Okay, great. So with that, let's move along to South Carolina. and how we'd go about creating a new entity in South Carolina. One would think it would be similar to its sister in North Carolina, but what does it look like?
And actually, I should be correct. They are very similar. As we go through these, we'll see this. It's also here their Secretary of State that governs South Carolina formations. Their domestic articles is actually a 4-page form, and it's basically all a fill-in. Basically, we've just talked about has all the basics to be aware of. The interesting ones, again, much like we just saw in North Carolina, they have a checkbox of whether you're public benefit, religious, or a mutual benefit corporation. Section 4, they do have a members checkbox as well. So this seems to be something that the Carolinas are interested in, is whether your nonprofit has members. And then further down, Section 6 is another checkbox for whether you're public benefit and religious corporations only. And this is where it sets up your 501c3 dissolution language if you're one of those two. Section 7 is a checkbox for mutual benefit corporations only and sets up their different post-dissolution asset distributions.
Say that fast.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't even say it slow.
Post-dissolution asset distributions. Okay.
Yes. Section 8 is a blank box for allowing other additional and optional provisions. Section 10 is interesting. It notes, quote, each original director of the nonprofit corporation must sign the articles, but only if the directors are named in these articles, unquote. So they ask you to not only name them, but then to have them actually sign the document. Then they have an additional 1-page 501c3 attachment that needs to be filed with the articles. It's very similar to what we just saw with the North Carolina N14 form. It has a checkbox list of the generic purpose items, religious, charitable, educational, and it also has that 501c3 dissolution language again. It also notes prohibited activities under the IRS code. Note that the agent that you decide on, we haven't talked about agents in a few episodes, but the agent you decide on will need to sign their acceptance of appointment on these articles as well. So you're talking a lot of wet signatures on this document.
So that's the domestic nonprofit. How about the foreign nonprofit? How do we go about qualifying to do business there?
So for a foreign nonprofit, they have an application by a foreign nonprofit corporation for a certificate of authority to transact business in the state of South Carolina. This is a 3-page form that mimics a lot of what we just saw in the domestic articles. The items to think about here really would be Section 7, again, the members checkbox. Section 8, the checkbox of whether you're a public benefit, religious, or mutual benefit corporation. Section 9, which asks for the names and business addresses of directors and officers. And here, too, as we discussed, the agent will need to sign off on their acceptance for the foreign application as well. But here, only one officer needs sign the certificate. It doesn't have to be all the directors or all the officers. Additionally, with your registration, you can file your initial annual report of corporations. This is true for both the domestic and the foreign nonprofits. They have a generic form, CL1, for both nonprofit and profit corporations, and it's driven by the Department of Revenue in South Carolina. So this is kind of similar to what we talked about with Louisiana last month. Items to note here, it does ask for your EIN. It asks for the month that you close your books. As it is generic, it asks for share status, but this can be marked to NA. It asks for the name and address of the directors and officers. You can file within 60 days of forming or registering, but we would recommend obviously filing the state's requirement as close as possible to get this in as soon as you can. The EIN requirement does obviously present a concurrence issue if you're doing a domestic filing in that you want to have your domestic name and everything approved before you file for your EIN with the IRS. But otherwise, really within closer to the first day than 60 days out.
Talk a little bit about the cost and the timing for filings and how much is disclosed there in the Secretary of State filings.
For sure. So the filing fee for the domestic nonprofit is $25, and for the foreign, it's actually only $10.
Wow.
That initial and annual report is another $25. Here, too, the preference for that one is you file online. Per their website last week, the online filing is usually completed within 24 hours.
Well,
mailed-in forms, yeah, I know, that's really nice. Mailed-in forms take 2 to 3 business days, and they're all contingent on their workload volume. But with that, too, because they've got that small window, they don't offer an expedite option. On the privacy side, as we noted, the articles in the foreign application will need to identify officers and directors, but not much past that. Like I said, for the annual report, you'll have to note the company's EIN as well, but that's something that's going to be publicly available anyways.
Annual reports. What does that look like?
So there's not an annual report in the sense of you're filing something directly with the Secretary of State. Instead, nonprofit corporations are required to renew by the 15th day of the 5th month following the close of their tax year. This is filed along with your nonprofit tax returns. The form itself is essentially a tax return that also renews your business license status in South Carolina, and the fee then will be tied to whatever your tax return has. And in theory, that would be $0.
Well, that's efficient.
Yes. In the age of where we have 4 or 5 filings we talk about potentially for you in any given state, this moves you back down to 1 a year after you've been put into place and registered.
So other state agencies, how does South Carolina supervise nonprofits, or does it?
So in South Carolina, if you're organized there in the state, or you're a foreign that solicits, hold assets, or does business in South Carolina, here too you will register with the South Carolina Secretary of State through their Division of Public Charities. It's much the same. They do have an annual. It's tied to the tax return that we were just talking about as well. There's a small form that goes with it too, but it's relatively simple. And then the Department of Revenue handles all the state tax exemption requests for your nonprofit. As always, we'll drop all the show notes to both the front pages for the Secretary of State, both their public charities and their business, the Department of Revenue, and the specific forms where they're applicable as well.
While we were chatting, I did look, and North Carolina does in fact have a database that puts annual reports online, very similar to California. And I'm looking at South Carolina right now, and it has a search charities function also. So very similar to what California does and many other states in terms of being able to search a charity that's qualified to do business and incorporated in either of these states. Their Secretary of State makes the annual filings public. So that's consistent, but some nice little features in both North Carolina and South Carolina in terms of ease of use for the organizers. So I think with that, we'll wrap up this Quick Tips episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to all these resources in North Carolina and South Carolina, and links to the earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. And I'll also put that link in there about the distinction between directors, officers, members, trustees, those terms of art in the nonprofit field. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Farella, Braun & Martel has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one we are building, where all the state filing episodes are in one place. So look for that link in the show notes if you'd like to see the comprehensive list. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.